Welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast with Ben Pakulski, one of the world's top professional bodybuilders, an expert on human performance and mindset mastery. Ben dives deep to deliver the strategies of the top experts to upgrade your body, mind, muscle, strength, performance, biochemistry, and how to become the upgraded modern man. Join us on benpakulski.com to learn the cutting-edge techniques to take control of your body, your brain, and create your greatest life.
Hey, what's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to the Muscle Expert Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Pakulski. We frame this podcast around living your greatest life in your greatest body. We've been so blessed to have over 100 guests this year, averaging 2 podcasts each week with the world's greatest humans. We've gone to every aspect of health optimization and physique optimization and brought you the best and brightest from around the globe. And today, we review that year, diving into the 7 most impactful podcasts, I guess, the ones that you guys enjoyed the most, the 7 most highly downloaded podcasts. We're going to give you a brief insight into the most valuable points from each of those podcasts, also framing it around the 6 pillars of a lean, healthy, muscular body. So to look back on this year, some of my favorite podcasts have been my conversations with Jordan Shallow. You guys know Jordan's become an incredible friend of mine, and I met him through the podcast. And I feel incredibly blessed to have Jordan in my life. And if you're not familiar with Dr. Jordan, we're going to give you some really awesome insights into his brilliance in some condensed clips in today's podcast. Dr. Ralph Esposito, this little-known, brilliant human from New York City, just continue to drop wisdom after wisdom on us in our podcast when he tells us about the 3 hacks for testosterone. And I highly suggest you, if you haven't listened to that full podcast, go back and do it now after listening to this one. Dr. Rick Hanson's podcast was one that I was extremely overwhelmed to partake in, to be honest. I was a little bit nervous and extremely excited that he agreed to join me on the podcast. Dr. Rick's book was probably the most impactful book of 2018. The book, The Buddha's Brain, is just this wealth of incredible value and information on the brain, how the brain works, how we think, and ultimately how we manifest stress or create stress in our lives, and ultimately how to overcome it. It was a hugely impactful book on helping me change the way I framed the way I look at the world, and ultimately the way I frame looking at stress. Probably the most impactful book of 2018 for sure. And if you haven't checked out Buddha's Brain by Dr. Rick Hanson, do that and absolutely listen to the key points that are coming at you in today's year recap. Our most downloaded episode of the year, maybe the most controversial, Dr. Layne Norton. Layne came into the studio to have a conversation with me about nutrition and about all of his particularly controversial opinions on things. Layne likes to be outspoken about his feelings and his feeling to tell people that they don't have the right to express opinions, or at least express educational opinions that are unfounded. And I agree with him at some levels. But interesting conversation with Layne Norton you guys are going to love. If you haven't already listened to it, check it out. But most importantly, listen to this summary of what we've talked about. Gentleman that I've had on twice this year because, truthfully, he's just that bright, and I wanted to learn a little bit more about him and his wisdom. And that's Dr. Dan Pardy from Human OS. And in this summary, we discussed the effects of sleep on body composition. And Dan's recent podcast was, on optimizing deep sleep and some of the drugs that can be used for sleep. One of the most impactful human beings in my life to this point, thus far, is Greg Roscoff, the creator of muscle activation techniques. Greg literally kept me in the game in bodybuilding for the last 24 months. Any time I had an injury, people don't know that 5 weeks out from the Mr. Olympia, I was basically bedridden with a severe back injury, and I'd been to 5 or 6 therapists, and nobody could do anything for me. I literally couldn't stand up. So I took some painkillers, hopped on a flight to Denver, went straight to Greg's office. Greg treated me, and he said, well, How do you feel? I said, well, it's still a little tender. He said, okay, we'll take the rest of the day off. When you wake up tomorrow, I want you to break it. I want you to see what you can do to hurt it again. Ultimately, maybe not in so many words. He said, just go, he's like, if you feel fine, go train it. Do something that's challenging. So I went in, not having been able to stand up for a week, and did 400-pound bent over rows with a barbell with no pain whatsoever. And then the next morning I squatted and was back on full speed after, literally nobody had been able to fix me. I think I'd been, like I said, to 6 therapists and massage therapists and every tech imaginable, and nobody could do anything. And Greg fixed me after one session. And our conversation is about how the nervous system governs stability, contraction, what MAT is, and why anyone who's struggling with any injury would want to change their paradigm around rehabilitation. So rehabilitation has a very particular paradigm, and Greg's thoughts are the most intelligent I've ever heard, the most logical, and completely counterintuitive to what most people are talking about. And the final podcast you're going to hear today is, again, one of your favorites. You guys loved Dr. Zach Bush, and he's absolutely one of the brightest human beings I've ever had on the show in his ability to articulate gut health, and glyphosate is second to no one on the planet, I'm sure. Dr. Zach Bush is an absolute wealth of information, drops it on you today in a summary of understanding gut health, the microbiome, and glyphosate. So there you have the 2018 Muscle Expert Podcast Year in Review coming at you. I hope you guys love it. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm so grateful for each and every one of you. I hope your year was amazing. I hope I in some way contributed a tiny bit to helping you live your greatest life in your greatest body, or maybe a large bit. And if so, I'd love to hear from you guys. As we shift into 2019 and set new goals and create new limits or remove old limits, and we demand excellence of ourselves in every aspect of life in 2019, I urge you to push forward and create the greatest version of yourself, because you deserve it. And I'm here to support you every step of the way in any way that I can. And thank you all for being a part of my life, and I'm grateful to be a part of yours. And I also want to bring a special announcement to you guys before we begin this podcast, that beginning January 2019, the Muscle Expert Podcast is going to no longer exist. It's now going to be called the Muscle Intelligence Podcast. And I think the reason being, for the longest time, the show was exclusively about muscle, and it was about trying to find people who are experts in the muscle building space. I never claimed to be a muscle expert myself. I just claimed to be someone who was catalyzing the conversations between myself and other experts, and with a unique perspective, perhaps, a unique experience base, perhaps, but never claimed to be an expert myself. But I love to be able to provide an intelligent approach to living your greatest life. And accordingly, we are now shifting as of this day forward. The Muscle Expert Podcast will cease to exist and will now be known as the Muscle Intelligence Podcast. What will that mean to you guys? Absolutely nothing. Same information, same incredible guests. Why we're doing it is the Muscle Expert moniker tends to come with a very specific stigma. People tend to frame us as being exclusively muscle building oriented, and although muscle intelligence is not that much of a divergence, it's enough of a divergence to not detract people from coming and sitting down and listening to our podcast. We find that a lot of our listeners are, once they've started the podcast, they love it, but maybe had a little bit of a hesitance to ever download it for the first time, because like, oh, I don't really want to build muscle. I don't really want to be a muscle expert. I get it. So we've decided to shift away and lean toward the Muscle Intelligence Podcast, which is ultimately my business as well. Teaching you guys how to live your greatest life in your greatest body is the framing of my mission in life. So I hope you guys continue to enjoy the podcast. It means nothing to you if you're already enjoying the podcast and are subscribed. You may be asked at some point to resubscribe so that you can continue to get notifications from us on the next podcast. If you notice that you're not continuing to get new episodes, we have not disappeared. We are still here. You may just have to go look for a different title on iTunes. We're probably putting them on both channels to begin with, but we definitely want to have everybody shifted over to muscleintelligence.com and Muscle Intelligence Podcast in 2019. I hope you guys have loved being part of the Muscle Expert Podcast, and I've loved having you as part of my family. To commemorate the Muscle Expert podcast, for everyone who's enjoyed it, we're going to do a limited run of Muscle Expert t-shirts, Muscle Expert hats, and some hoodies. Very, very limited run, because I've had some people express the interest in being part of the mission that the Muscle Expert was putting out. So as we roll forward, we'll be putting out some Muscle Expert gear, and also be putting out some Muscle Intelligence gear, so you guys can be part of the new mission to ultimately help every man and woman with the knowledge and the skill set to build their greatest body so they can truthfully live their greatest life. Enjoy the episode, guys. When I first moved from Canada to the US, I had this process of getting ready for contests nailed. Like, I'd come with striated glutes out every time. I knew when I did this happened to my body. If I added a little cardio, this would happen. If I added another workout, that would happen. If I took out some food, this would happen. It was like I had it down to, the process was a science. I had notebooks. I did the exact same thing every week, and I changed it every week. And then I moved to the US, and all of a sudden, none of that stuff works. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? So, different environment requires a different adaptation, right? Yeah. So my body responded differently to food, differently to the environment, differently, just everything was different, right? So from that perspective, what you're saying is so relevant, but it has to be grounded in science, right? It has to be grounded in, okay, well, what should potentially be the next thing that I could do to troubleshoot these problems that are arising?
And I love the way you worded that. You said change in environment. And I think a lot of people will listen to that and think of just geography. They'll think, change in environment from Toronto to Tampa Bay. Mm-hmm. Change in environment is literally the definition of stimulus.
Exactly.
That's what, I mean, in the powerlifting space where the objective outcome is resistance, that's where the corrective exercise, corrective exercise just exists left to of a integer on a continuum where it's like the same stimulus adaptations that I'm going to use to get someone from injured to healthy, I'll use to get them to healthy to the strongest in the world.
Sure.
Right. And stimulus, when you needed to define stimulus as micromanaged and as small a categories as you can break them up into, because then once you can start breaking everything up, and I mean frequency and volume, intensity, duration, density of workouts, time under tension. Yep. The further you can subdivide all of these, the more tools you now have to play with, exactly. Right?
Yep.
And it's like, and sometimes getting, like, for me being in the strength athlete, it's like putting more weight on the bar is sometimes the last measure of force production that I'm going to worry about when it comes to getting stronger.
And I love that you bring that stuff up, because those are things that people aren't aware of, or they're not paying attention to as much as they should and could be, right? It's like people are like, hey, if my weight didn't go up this week, I did something wrong. Yeah. But ultimately, I'm an advocate. If I'm trying to get better at squatting, let's say I'm trying to become a world-class squatter, I don't think I need to squat all the time. Do I want to squat? Of course. Do I need to squat 100% of my max all the time? No, it's a skill. And if you can get better at the skill of squatting while getting stronger at other things, by deductive reasoning, we would hope that you're going to get better. Whereas if your skill starts to break at some level, meaning you're getting too close to the max and you're doing some grinding reps and you're doing forced reps, you start to develop bad habits, you're ingraining that in your nervous system, and you're I think, taking away from the skill. And that's where a lot of people go wrong in this endeavor of, optimizing their body composition or optimizing their strength. They're getting away from the skill acquisition and more focused on today, I got to hit a PR today, rather than because they can need to post it on Instagram.
Absolutely.
And be like, oh man, I got to show I got a PR today. Who fucking cares? Yeah. Like, the only thing I care about, and like you, I care about winning the event. Like we talked about that. One more reminder for you guys. If you are someone who is in Australia or in the Australia area, being New Zealand or Thailand or Singapore or Hong Kong, anywhere like that, and you're interested in joining myself and Dr. Jordan Shallow for a one-day seminar or 3 days of seminars and training camps, this may be your only opportunity to hit us up in Australia. January 11th through the 28th, we are going to be visiting Sydney, then Perth, then Melbourne, and we may be making a stop in Gold Coast, depending on how busy we are through Sydney, Perth, and Melbourne, but we'll definitely be in those 3 locations. If you guys are interested in joining, you can get more information at musclecamps.com, just the way it sounds, musclecamps.com. You can check the link in show notes. The space is extremely limited, and we're looking forward to working personally one-on-one with you if you're really serious about results. Now, people are curious about who this is for. It's not just for bodybuilders. It's not just for competitive powerlifters. If you're someone who's serious about your results, you're someone who's serious about making the most of your time, not only now, but for the rest of your life, we're going to empower you with a skill set to build your greatest body, whether it be getting super, super strong or building a big, beautiful, muscular body, which is what I have become known for. If you're interested in that, check out musclecamps.com. We will be in Sydney January 11th through the 13th. We'll be in Perth the 18th through the 20th, and we'll be in Melbourne at Doherty's Gym on the 25th through the 27th of January. And we look forward to seeing you guys there. As I said, there's options to come to a single-day camp, or single-day seminar, or there's options to be coming to a 3-day training camp, working with us one-on-one in the gym, getting your butt kicked, working really hard. If you want to learn more, head to musclecamps.com or go on iTunes and check out the podcast I did with Dr. Jordan Shallow very recently. Him and I talk a little bit about all the stuff we're going to be teaching, and you can hear our comedic banter. I hope you guys enjoy the show. I really appreciate you, Dr. Esposito. I want to finish with one question about 3 lifestyle, to use the common catchphrase, hacks that you can recommend for people that you implement yourself to optimize testosterone and avoid or eliminate xenoestrogens.
So number 1, sleep over everything. So don't think that you're going to wake up, want 5 hours of sleep, and think that 5 a.m. workout is going to be more beneficial than getting an extra 2 hours of sleep.
So that's my question, right? Is like if it's I get to work out, meditate, or sleep, what do you choose?
Sleep.
Good.
Sleep 1.
Every time, or do you alternate?
That's a tough question. I'm going to say sleep over everything. Sleep over exercise. Meditation is definitely helpful, but unless you're meditating for an hour, most people have a difficult time meditating for an hour. So, but definitely include meditation. I do it every morning. So sleep, number 1. Meditation, if you don't like that word meditation, call it mindfulness. If you don't like that word mindfulness.
And prayer.
Prayer is great.
Right. Whatever you're attached to.
As simple as breathing. Just doing 5 seconds breathing in, hold, 5 seconds breathing out. That's as simple. You do that 4 or 5 times, you'll lower your stress levels. Right.
And so
sleep, meditation.
Yep.
And the one final thing in terms of improving testosterone levels, or
even eliminating xenoestrogens. Is there something you do in your lifestyle that allows you to avoid those things that you know to be estrogenic?
Yeah. So, I kind of say this as a matter of fact. I haven't eaten out of plastic for a while. Mm-hmm. I would try to have people minimize the amount of times that they use a microwave and plastic. Getting a good quality a water filter, because there are xenobiotics. There's antibiotics.
Which one do you use?
The Berkeley.
Okay.
Or Berkey.
Berkey, yep.
Yeah, that one works really well.
The short version on the negativity bias, I say we've got a brain that's like Velcro for bad experiences, but Teflon for good ones.
Yeah.
And we all know what that's like, right? You're in a relationship with somebody, you work with somebody, 10 things happen in the day, 9 are positive, 1 is negative. What's the one we tend to brood over? What's the one that we get resentful about, or we build up a case in our mind about, or we start thinking at 2 a.m. what we should have said or what we're going to do, and round it goes. That's the negativity bias at work. And the reason for it is that we are big animals, and we are the result of 3.5, nearly 4 billion years of evolution of life on the planet. That's really pretty extraordinary just to think about it. And during that time, starting around 600 million or so years ago, our ancestors had started to develop nervous systems. So these early jellyfish and then fish and crabs and lizards, mice, monkeys, and human beings over that long, long run had to basically do two things. They had to avoid sticks, as it were, like predators and natural hazards and aggression inside their band or between other bands. They had to avoid sticks, but they also had to go get carrots, like food or shelter or mating opportunities. And both are important. But if you think about it, if you don't get a carrot today or a banana, you'll have a chance at one tomorrow. But if you don't avoid that saber-toothed tiger or that angry alpha male in your band, whew, no more carrots forever. So naturally then, the brain today does these five fundamental things routinely. Scans for bad news, overfocuses upon it, overreacts to it, fast tracks the whole package into memory, once burned, twice shy, and then fifth, the brain gradually gets sensitized to that negative experience through the stress hormone cortisol, which goes up into your brain and overstimulates the amygdala, which is the alarm bell of the brain, and cortisol weakens a part of the brain called the hippocampus that calms down the amygdala and puts things in perspective. This creates a vicious cycle. Experiences of stress today, including minor irritation or being trapped in traffic while you're late to a meeting or squabbling with your partner or feeling isolated and lonely. Loneliness is quite stressful. Or feeling frustrated that you're not able to get something done like you wanted to get it done. That releases cortisol, goes up into the brain, and makes us just a little more sensitive, a little more vulnerable to upsetting, irritating, anxiety-provoking experiences tomorrow, which makes us even more vulnerable the day after that. This is Mother Nature's plan. It's by design. It was really, really effective. I can get into any of the details you might want about it, but the net of it is that, in effect, we have this well-designed learning disability. We all do. We're walking around with this bias that's really useful if you're living in a combat zone or in Jurassic Park, or you're growing up in what feels like a combat zone, maybe in poverty or in an abusive family environment. Maybe in some ways the negativity bias is helpful. But for most people, today, in most minutes and most lives and most relationships, it creates so much unnecessary suffering and so much unnecessary conflict between people.
What do you feel the first step is? I would say at some point in basically everyone's life, we've dealt with, some degree of anxiety and obviously massive amounts of stress. Most people, when they're children, probably attach to the story that they had some degree of stressful childhood. Whether or not it's true, it's your perception of it. And hey, I was very, very stressed as a child. And now I realize I've got this negativity bias and I'd like to start shifting because I'm becoming conscious and I'm realizing I don't want to live that life anymore. I hate the fact that I'm modeling whomever has come before me. And I want to start living a conscious life that allows me to have a positive framing rather than a negative one. What do you feel like the first step to start taking is to make that change?
Yeah, I'll say four things, actually, but they'll be quick. The first step is to deal with the real crud in your life. Okay. In other words, actually, if we cope, if we look for a better job, if we find a different partner, if we move to this degree we can out of our neighborhood, if we address things about our own bodies that we don't feel good about, if we feel stuck in some kind of situation, take action as best you can. If you're worried about money, take action as best you can. I'm not trying to be pie in the sky here. I'm actually saying, hey, be realistic. And deal with things. I think a lot of people spin out into negative rumination because they're not dealing with things. So first and foremost, deal with real things. Second, don't marinate in the negative. Be irritated as long as you need to be irritated. Be worried as long as you need to be worried. Be sad in a natural way. Let those feelings flow through you, but don't marinate in them, because as soon as you start marinating in them, you internalize them. As you said at the beginning, the brain is plastic. Much as bodies are plastic, if you work them in different ways, for better or worse, the brain is plastic in that same sense. It's actually changed physically, as you know, by the experiences we're having, especially negative ones. So if you're looping in irritated arguments with other people or self-criticism or just kind of being stuck in a worry of some kind, that's really bad for you. So as soon as you can, Don't fuel them. Step out of them. Don't chase them. Don't follow them. Don't put gasoline on that fire. That's the second thing to do.
That was one of the best things that I got from the Buddha's brain.
The body likes to be in a rhythm. It's the same reason that people on shift work don't do that well, right? Like, because they can never get in a rhythm with their sleep. Even though, they still get enough, the body's, it's not the same.
I completely agree with you on that, man. And your body gets, and you talk about metabolic flexibility, right? Your body gets really, really efficient at one or the other, or sometimes for some people get really efficient at both.
Right.
But I'd love to bring that conversation about now, because obviously you're well versed on the research and talking about the influence of metabolic flexibility on someone's ability to shift.
Yeah. So the best way to be metabolically flexible is to eat both.
Eat both,
and be consistent.
Yeah.
A lot of the research came out with, there was a study done where they looked at a higher fat, higher protein versus a higher carb breakfast, and saw that you burned more fat throughout the day, more fat oxidation throughout the day on a higher fat. Of course you did. So this is what I always tell people. If you eat more fat, you'll burn more fat.
Sure.
This is the thing with keto is that, well, you burn all fat. Okay, but you're also eating a ton of fat, so you also store more fat, right? So if you eat higher carb, lower fat, what happens is you burn less fat, but you also store less fat. The net is going to be what your surplus or deficit is, right? So with metabolic flexibility, because we operate on a 24-hour clock, right? So if I eat higher fat at breakfast, if my macros stay the same, if I'm consistent, by default, I have to eat lower fat and higher carb later in the day, right? So like, let's say I had, my intake was 200 grams of carbs a day and 80 grams of fat. Mm-hmm. And let's say I have 30 grams of fat for breakfast, no carbs. And then, but that means the last half of the day, I'm going to have lower fat and higher carb by default, right? So
what if you just batch the carbs into one meal? Well, I guess 200 grams may be a little excessive, but like
you can do it.
Yeah.
Well, what happens is, so this is how beautiful the human body is. So they've looked at this. They've looked at, one meal versus 8 meals or whatever you do. So what happens is at that one meal, like if you have that much carbs, you get a real high insulin release. You're going to store a lot more fat at that one meal.
Yeah.
But
what if there's no fat in that meal?
Well, you're still, because fat digestion is so slow, you're still going to have stuff
floating. Sure.
And you've always got this is the thing that people don't understand. Your liver is always producing lipids.
Sure.
Right? So even if you don't have exogenous fats, there's always fats floating around that can be stored. And that's why the body is so beautiful like that. People do all these things to try and trick it, and it's really hard to trick it. So if you get later in the day, you have that big meal, you store more fat at that meal, but guess what? If you had, let's say you had all your carbs at one meal, yes, you're going to store a lot of.
What if it was right after the workout? So you burned through a bunch of, oxidizing a bunch of fat. Just being devil's advocate, right?
So right. I'll come back to that.
Sure.
So you store more at that couple hours time space. You're going to store a lot of it.
Yeah.
Then you've got 22 hours where you're post-absorptive, and you're going to burn off a lot of it, right? So then the net effect is, what is your surplus or deficit? And then as far as like workouts, so let's play that, right? So let's say we had one person, let's say they work out at night. One person eats all their let's say just all their calories in the morning. One person eats all of them after a workout, right? So if you look at the Melu, well, you're going to store a lot in the morning, right? You haven't worked out. You're going to store a lot. You're going to have topped off glycogen. You're going to store some body fat. You work out, you're going to deplete some of that glycogen. And while your body is trying to refill that glycogen, it's going to burn through fats to spare carbohydrate to go to glycogen because glycogen has priority. Well, what ends up happening is it's still the net is the same. But what I would say is, what makes you feel better, right? Yeah. What do you feel better on? What can you train harder on? And even if it's placebo, that's still fine. Right? Because placebo can be powerful.
Like feeling better is a massive thing.
I like to eat a lot of food before I go in to train. Yeah. She knows I can eat like a whole pizza and go train.
Sure.
And for leg day. Now, it means I'm going to spend some time on the pot, right? Well, when it's squat day. But like she does not, Holly does not like to train with anything on her stomach. She wants to be fasted.
Not that this matters, but a strength-based stimulus, I'm assuming, not a hypertrophy-based stimulus. Would that be a different, not that this is obviously on topic, but you'd still eat a whole pizza before you did hypertrophy-based leg workout?
That might be a little different.
Without wasting any time, let's dive right into how is sleep influencing people's body composition, man, and is it influencing their body composition as much as we believe it is?
Yeah, so I started tapping into this idea that there is a really important connection between sleep and weight probably 15 years ago. I started to see some publications in the field that looked at people that are undergoing or had undergone pretty significant sleep deprivation. So that was the nature of the studies. And then they did some endocrinological parameters. They looked at their blood. They looked at other hormones at the same time. And what they discovered, it was sort of like a fishing expedition. It wasn't specifically around looking at those parameters. But what they found is that certain hormones that are involved in energy regulation, things like leptin, things like ghrelin, were altered. They looked different than if somebody had gotten full sleep. And that led to the hypothesis that perhaps there was some important connection there. Mm-hmm. Concurrently, there was some epidemiological work and longitudinal work that was noticing this very strong connection between people that get less sleep in general compared to those that get more sleep in general and their risk for being obese. And what one study found is that it was it was an assessment of a variety of studies. 81 out of 89 studies that were looked at showed a strong connection between sleep loss and weight gain. So much so that if you're getting less than 6 hours per night on average, your risk for being obese was 55% higher than if you were getting the recommended 7 to 9 hours per night. So that's clearly there seemed to be something there because it was very consistent. Then you also had within lab studies that were now showing some metabolic alterations. And this led to a really interesting story over time, which was, various researchers around the world looking into it. And so to give a little bit of a primer on leptin, I bet a lot of your audience already knows what this is, but this is a fat-derived hormone. So we used to think that fat was simply just a inert substance that kept the body warm and provided energy, but we now know that it releases up to 50 different metabolically active compounds, right, most of which are inflammatory. Leptin is a cytokine that actually the role of it is to go up to the brain and signal to the brain, this is how much fat you have in your body. That is its main purpose. And so let's kind of put ourselves into an imaginary space where you overeat one weekend, right? It's Thanksgiving, you just stuff yourself. Theoretically, because you're storing more fat in your fat tissue, you're going to be then producing more leptin. That's going to go to the brain, and then it's going to make you less hungry. It's going to increase your energy expenditure. And it'll do this whether you really recognize it or not. Now, the other side of that is if you go try to lose weight, your leptin stores are going to decrease, and that is going to then signal to the brain, eat more food and create a metabolic profile that helps you store more energy into fat. And then the whole point is to try to maintain a relative balance or homeostasis. And this is considered what's called the set point, right? So that's why, you might, a really good way to think of it is if, a thermostat in your home to set temperature, you set it at 72 degrees. If the temperature drops, right, it kicks on the heater to get it up. And if it gets above that, it kicks on the air conditioning to get it down. Same type of system.
So we know that strengthening muscles move bones, strengthening muscles and making muscles work more effectively is the ideal ultimate result. But how exactly have you created a modality that does that and does it well?
So going back to my experience with the team chiropractor with the Utah Jazz, I was the range of motion guy, and I'm exposed to muscle testing. And many of the tests in clinical kinesiology test the muscles in mid-range position. I mean, if you're checking internal rotation, the piriformis would be tested in like 20 degrees of hip external rotation. But the person may have 45 degrees of external rotation. So what I was finding was that correlation between everything. As I started learning muscle testing and playing around with them, I started realizing that everyone that had a limitation in range of motion there was correlating weaknesses that associated with that limitation in range of motion. So if I saw somebody that had 20 degrees of external rotation on the left side and 40 degrees on the right side, it's like, oh, they're tight. Well, my conventional thought process was I need to stretch the internal rotator. And then it was like, well, actually, there's correlating weaknesses here also. All the muscles that shorten into external rotation, from the piriformis to the obturator, gemellus, all these muscles that create external rotation or shorten into external rotation, I would test and they would be weak. And then I would get those muscles activated, and I'll talk about that in a second, and all of a sudden, not only were the muscles strong, but now all of a sudden that side could move to 45 degrees of external rotation also. And I'm like, man, I've been focusing on tightness my whole career, and now I'm finding that if I get muscles activated and I improve their ability to contract, they can shorten more effectively, and the opposite muscles will relax. So the whole... I had to go back and relearn my whole anatomy when I put this program together, because now I had to understand the function of every muscle, how it shortens, and how to test it from the shortened position. Because when you have inflammation, the muscles, there's a physiological reason behind it, but the weaknesses are going to show up in the shortened position. We're the strongest in neutral. That's why we revert to the neutral position when we walk on ice. We enclose ourselves toward our center of gravity, and the muscles are kind of encompassed around the neutral position in every joint. So, and you think about it, when somebody gets old and dysfunctional, their range of motion decreases throughout their body. Their gait patterns decrease, their stride length shortens. And so the same physiological changes that you see when somebody walks on ice, you start to see when somebody's neuromuscular system starts to decline, or the integrity of the neuromuscular system declines with age. And so tightness is a sign of weakness. And so that was the primary change. I had to make a paradigm shift in my whole thought process and recognize that every time that I see limitations in range of motion, it means that one or more of the muscles that cross that axis are potentially weak.
We know we are stripping the intestinal environment naked from its ecosystem by the amount of antibiotic we're exposed to. Of course, our doctors are prescribing a lot of antibiotics for anything from bronchitis and upper respiratory stuff all the way to urinary tract or whatever it may be. However, the vast majority of antibiotics that we consume as Americans is in our food. And so meat especially. And so if you're a high meat intake, paleo diet, kind of ketogenic kind of thing, and you're pounding a lot of meat protein, what you don't know is you're getting, or maybe you do and you're frustrated by it, is you're getting an enormous amount of Roundup, which is a weed killer.
Glyphosate, yep.
That glyphosate compound within the Roundup has never been patented as a weed killer. It's only been patented as an antibiotic, anti-parasite, antifungal. It kills all of the single-celled organisms. So it's the most potent antibiotic we have in our environment as far as I'm concerned, and it has a second huge detriment to the food. You can imagine what would happen. Right now we're spraying 4.5 billion pounds of Roundup into the soils of the earth. So it's the number one toxin on the planet right now. Some 75% of the air you breathe in the United States can be contaminated with that Roundup. Some 75% of the rainfall that falls on us is contaminated with Roundup. So we've introduced a water-soluble toxin that's now infiltrated all levels of the ecosystem, but it's also infiltrated all levels of our body. So your muscles are dealing with it. It's toxic to the mitochondria within those muscles, and it's all the way from the bloodstream, gut, all the way into your urine. We just did a clinical trial looking at healthy people and their effects on a supplement we'll tell you about a bit. And it was amazing to see all these healthy people come through, and not a single one of them had clean urine. Everybody had glyphosate in their urine, no matter how aggressive they were being with their organic diet or whatnot. We are just surrounded by this chemical that is a potent antibiotic. So now imagine what's happening to our soil. We're denuding our soil of bacteria and fungi by spraying an antibiotic on it.
Join us on benpakulski.com to learn the cutting-edge techniques to take control of your body, your brain, and create your greatest life.
The critical micronutrients things like selenium, manganese, and all these things are actually critical for muscle
This podcast
metabolism
is for information
aren't present
purposes
in the
only.
food
The
because
statements
it
and
never got
views on this
delivered to the
podcast are
root
not
system of
medical
that
advice.
plant.
This podcast, including
Then you
Ben
take it a
Mikulski
step
and the
further
producers,
and
disclaims
find out that the
responsibility
same
for any
mechanisms by
possible
which
adverse
the
effects
Roundup
from the
is
use of
blocking
information contained herein.
metabolism in the
Opinions of
bacteria to
guests
kill
are their
it.
own, and this
It
podcast
blocks
does not
that same
endorse or
enzyme
accept
pathway in the
responsibility for
plants.
statements
And the
made by
plants now
guests.
can't
This
make
podcast
essential
does not
amino
make any
acids.
representations or
There's three of
warranties
them:
about guest
phenylalanine,
qualifications or
tyrosine,
credibility.
and
This podcast
tryptophan
may contain
that are
paid
made through
endorsements
this
or
enzyme
advertisements
pathway
for
that's
products or
blocked directly
services.
by
Individuals
glyphosate.
on this podcast may have a
And so
direct
this
or
Roundup
indirect financial
chemical is
interest in
blocking
products
the
or
ability
services
for you to
referred
make
to
three
herein.
of
If
your
you think you have a
26
medical
amino
problem,
acids.
consult a licensed
There's
physician.